We were a species of memory, which is a poetic way of saying we were cowards. The Xylosian people had traded swords for styluses 10 millennia ago, after the last of the great pruning wars taught us that the galaxy was a garden that grew only thorns. Our purpose, we decided, was not to cultivate it, but to record its savage beauty. We built the great archive on our moon, Xylos Prime, a sphere of polished obsidian and glowing crystal that held the memory of 1,000,000 worlds. It was our monument to non-intervention, our promise to the cosmos that we would watch, we would remember, but we would never again act. I was a senior archivist, Kalen, and I had come to believe our promise was a lie. History was not a lesson, it was a cage, and we were merely decorating the bars. For centuries, the bars had been gilded by the ascendancy, a sprawling theocracy that rose from the ashes of humanity's supposed self-immolation. They preached a doctrine of galactic harmony, a tranquil, unified existence under the benevolent gaze of their unseen matriarchs. Harmony, of course, was achieved through the systematic erasure of any culture deemed disharmonious. Their favorite targets were the dead, especially humanity. In ascendancy scripture, humans were the great cosmic mistake, a species of such inherent violence and chaos that their vanishing was a divine correction. All records of their age, the so-called Age of Fire, were either destroyed or locked away in the deepest vaults of my archive, classified as corrupting influences. I was one of the few with clearance to even breathe the same sterile air as those files. My work was my penance and my rebellion. I spent my cycles in the cold, silent depths of the archive, sifting through the digital ghosts of dead empires. On that particular cycle, my task was the final cataloging of artifacts from the Star Wanderer, a pre-ascendancy deep space probe recovered from the Tenebrous Veil. It was mostly junk stellar radiation logs, inert sensor data, a corrupted astrogation chart, but buried deep in a tertiary memory bank, shielded by encryption so old it was almost organic, was a single data fragment. My console flagged it as a humanity-era ghost signal, a remnant of an ancient emergency broadcast protocol. Ascendancy protocol was clear isolate, flag for purification, and move on. My superiors believed that even dead data could carry the human taint of chaos. I should have listened, but the historian in me, the part that chafed under the bland, sanitized history the ascendancy fed its flock, was curious. What final, desperate message had these mythical monsters tried to send? I isolated the fragment in a secure data space, a digital clean room, and began to run a decryption diagnostic. It was less a message and more of a key, a complex handshake protocol looking for a lock. The diagnostic program, in its brute force attempt to find the right sequence, inadvertently became the lock. For a nanosecond, a connection was made. My console flashed a single line of archaic human text, query received. Stand by. Before I could react, an impossibly dense packet of encrypted data, no larger than a grain of sand, was fired from the archive's core transmitter into the deep void. Then the connection vanished. The fragment went inert. My blood ran cold. I had broken a dozen protocols. I erased the logs, classified the fragment as degraded and inert, and filed the report. I tried to tell myself it was a fluke, a dead system's last electronic twitch, but a new memory had been logged in the archive of my soul, one of profound and terrible dread. Weeks bled into months. The galaxy continued its placid rotation under the Ascendancy's thumb. Harmony reigned. I almost convinced myself the incident was a dream, a byproduct of too many cycles spent communing with ghosts. Then the Tenebrous system went dark. It was a minor border system, notable only for its proximity to the veil from which the Star Wanderer had been salvaged. The official Ascendancy report, broadcast on all public channels, cited a cascading stellar flux event, a natural disaster. Tragic, but unavoidable. But the word on the internal Archivist network was different. Tenebrous hadn't just gone dark, it had gone silent. No distress calls, no automated beacon failures, no radiation spikes. Just nothing. A void where a system of 3 planets and a dozen orbital stations used to be. Using my clearance, I dove into the restricted military comms channels, pulling the fragmented data logs from the moments before the blackout. The reports were panicked, disjointed, and heavily redacted. They spoke of ships that moved without propulsion, of weapons that made no sound, of vessels shaped like shards of night. The descriptions were chillingly familiar. They didn't match the fleets of the hulking, brutish Githar pirates or the shimmering energy craft of the psychic Serene. They matched the forbidden texts, the suppressed histories of the human armada from the Age of Fire. Vessels built not for war, but for extermination. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. The ghost signal, the data packet. I had knocked on a door I never should have found, and something had answered. The silence from Tenebrous rattled the matriarchs. Harmony was their brand, and a silent system was bad for business. They dispatched the 7th Peacekeeper Fleet, a flotilla of gleaming white and gold cruisers, to investigate and render aid. Peacekeeper was the Ascendancy's word for enforcer. These ships weren't built for aid. They were built for orbital subjugation. Their mission was to re-establish contact and project an aura of unshakable calm. It was a show of force disguised as a mercy mission. I knew I had to see it. I couldn't live in the dark, wondering if my curiosity had unleashed a forgotten nightmare. Leveraging every bit of clearance and favor I had, I managed to get my terminal linked to a live telemetry feed from a single recon drone, designated Observer 7 attached to the fleet's flagship, the Pious Gaze. The feed was grainy, subject to the whims of interstellar distortion, but it was a window. I watched as the fleet tore open a rift in space-time and emerged into the Tenebrous system. The view that greeted them, that greeted me, was not one of a natural disaster. It was a graveyard. The system was perfectly, unnervingly still. Dozens of Ascendancy patrol ships and freighters floated dead in the void. There were no scorch marks, no twisted metal, no debris fields. The ships were pristine, except for the fact that many of them had been perfectly bisected, sliced in half as if by an impossibly sharp, impossibly large blade. Orbital stations were dark, their lights extinguished, their systems inert. My diagnostic scan, piggybacking on the drone's feed, showed they were not damaged, merely disabled. Power had been cut at a molecular level. The flow of electrons simply halted. There were no bodies. Scans showed 0 life signs, not on the ships, not in the stations, not even on the planets below. An entire system of millions vanished. The commander of the Pious Gaze was a zealot named High Cleric Valerius, a man whose faith was as unyielding as his jawline. I could hear his voice, tinny and laced with static, ordering his fleet into a defensive formation. He spoke of pirates, of an unknown Githar weapon. He refused to see the truth that was screaming from the silence around him, This wasn't the work of pirates. This was art. This was a statement. The pious gaze moved cautiously toward the system's main planet, Tenebris Prime, a once thriving agri-world. As it passed the shattered husk of a defense platform, a flicker of movement registered on my screen. It was small, almost too small to be a ship. It decloaked. The drone's camera zoomed in, its optical sensors struggling to resolve the image. The vessel was a blade of pure, non-reflective black. It had no visible engines, no weapon ports, no bridge, no lights. It absorbed the light of the nearby star, a hole in the fabric of reality. It hung there, impossibly still, a silent judgment before the might of the Peacekeeper fleet. Then, every comms channel in the galaxy, from the Ascendancy's core worlds to the farthest listening posts, was hijacked. The carefully curated hymns and sermons of the matriarchs were replaced by a single, clear voice. It was female, calm, and spoke flawless, modern Xylosian, the language of historians and diplomats. Her tone was not angry, not vengeful. It was the patient, deliberate tone of a teacher about to correct a flawed lesson. "We received your message, Archivist," the voice said, and I felt the floor of the universe fall away from beneath me. My name was not spoken, but I knew she was speaking to me. The historical record is incomplete. It will now be corrected. As the last word echoed in the sudden, galaxy-wide silence, a beam of energy, if it could be called that, erupted from the black ship. It wasn't light or plasma. It was a lance of pure void, a line of absolute nothingness that crossed the distance to the pious gaze in an instant. The flagship, a vessel miles long, protected by the most advanced energy shields in the Ascendancy, did not explode. It did not break apart. It simply unraveled. Where the beam touched, matter ceased to be. Metal, shields, crew, faith, all of it discorporated, its atoms unwriting themselves from existence. In seconds, the mighty warship was gone, leaving behind only a faint shimmer of residual energy and the horrified silence of its fleet. My terminal went dark as the drone. Observer 7 was consumed by the same non-event. I stumbled back from my console. A strangled gasp caught in my throat. My archives held stories of humanity's weapons fusion bombs that could crack planets, kinetic rods that could shatter moons. But this was something else. This was not the technology of a species that had vanished. This was the technology of a species that had evolved in the dark. I looked at my hands, the delicate, four-fingered hands of a scholar, a rememberer. I had not woken a ghost. I had not answered a distress call. I had rung a dinner bell. And the old gods had come home, hungry. The age of fire had not ended. It had merely been waiting for a spark. And I, Kalen, the coward, the archivist, had been the one to provide it. The galaxy did not scream. It held its breath. The witness's message, followed by the silent erasure of a capital ship, was an act of such impossible power that it broke the fundamental grammar of galactic conflict. War was loud. War was messy. It was fire and ruin and heroic. Tragic last stands. This was none of those things. It was a clean, quiet edit to the manuscript of reality. In the immediate aftermath, the Ascendancy did what all bloated, terrified empires do it lied. Within hours, a narrative was spun from the looms of the matriarch's propaganda ministry. The 7th Peacekeeper Fleet had not been attacked. It had encountered a previously unknown stellar phenomenon, A null space rupture in the Tenebris system. The loss of the pious Gaze and its crew was a tragic sacrifice in the name of science and exploration. To honor them, the Tenebris system was declared a quarantine zone, a memorial to the brave souls lost to the unpredictable whims of the cosmos. It was a masterful piece of fiction, calming and absolute, and the trillion souls under Ascendancy rule consumed it without question. But I had seen the truth. I had heard my title, Archivist, spoken by the void. The lie was a shroud, and I knew what corpse it was hiding. The great archive, once my sanctuary, became my prison. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward me. Every silent corridor echoed with footsteps that were not there. I was a loose thread in the matriarch's grand tapestry, and I could feel their spectral fingers plucking at me, preparing to pull me loose. My fears were given form 3 cycles later. They arrived not in warships, but in a single, unadorned silver spire of a ship that settled onto the Archive's private landing platform like a scalpel on a tray. They were the Inquisitors of Harmony, the Matriarch's Internal Affairs Division, a polite name for the secret police. Led by a gaunt, severe Xylosian named Prelate Kovar, they moved with an unnerving placidity that was far more terrifying than any open aggression. Kovar did not storm the archive. He requested an audience. He did not demand records. He expressed a newfound interest in pre-ascendancy deep space communications. He never mentioned Tenebris, never spoke of a rupture or a fleet. But when he looked at me across the grand reference hall, his pale eyes held the cold, sterile focus of a vivisectionist. He was not investigating an event. He was dissecting a heresy. He knew the source was here. He was looking for the Archivist. I knew my time was running out. I couldn't run. My biometrics were tied to every system on Xylos Prime. I couldn't hide. The archive was Kovar's hunting ground now. I needed something more than an escape plan. I needed the truth. The Ascendancy had built its empire on a foundation of redacted history. My only hope was to find the pages they had torn out. There was only one person I could turn to, the one soul in the galaxy who loved forbidden knowledge even more than I did. Ilara, the keeper of the Stasis Vault, my mentor, and the closest thing I had to a friend. Ilara was ancient, even by Xylosian standards. Her skin was the texture of old parchment, and her eyes held the weary wisdom of one who had read the final chapters of too many civilizations. She resided in the archive's deepest level, a place few even knew existed. The Stasis Vault. It was a repository for artifacts too dangerous or too fragile to be digitized, the physical remnants of the galaxy's most volatile memories. It was there, amidst the silent, sleeping relics, that I found her. I told her everything: the Star Wanderer fragment, the handshake protocol, the data burst, the voice that called me by my title. She listened without interruption, her expression as still as the cryo-preserved flora in the display case beside her. When I finished, my voice trembling, she did not recoil in horror or label me a fool. She simply nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. The Ascendancy teaches that a question is a symptom of disharmony, she said, her voice a dry whisper. The truth is, a question is a seed. You, Kalen, have just watered a forest they have spent 1,000 years trying to burn down. She led me past rows of artifacts, a Githar warlord's power axe, a serene thought crystal, a single iridescent scale from a leviathan that once swam in the gas clouds of Orion, to a small, unmarked door at the very back of the vault. The matriarchs believe this chamber holds the source of humanity's madness, she explained, pressing her withered hand against a bioscanner. They are right. It holds their history. The door irised open into a small, circular room. In the center, suspended in a shimmering stasis field, was not a weapon or a monstrous idol, but a book. It was bound in some dark, leathery material, its pages edged in tarnished silver. It was a physical object, a relic from an age before data crystals and neural uploads. The Journal of the Last Fleet, Ilara whispered, the only uncorrupted human artifact known to exist. The Ascendancy couldn't digitize it without triggering its internal defenses, and they were too afraid to destroy it, so they buried it. She deactivated the field, and the air in the room grew heavy, thick with the weight of ages. They say humanity destroyed itself in a final and inglorious war, that their chaos finally consumed them. She gestured for me to open the book. My hand shook as I touched the cover. It was not leather, it was biosynthetic skin, still faintly warm. The pages were not paper, but thin, flexible sheets of processed memory fiber. The text glowed with a soft, internal light as my fingers brushed against it. It was a military log, a history, a eulogy. It told a story that shattered a millennium of lies. Humanity had not burned out in a blaze of self-destruction. They had been on the verge of victory in a great galactic war, their armada pushing back a coalition of species known as the Covenant. But they were betrayed. A cabal of their supposed allies, the very species who would later form the bedrock of the Ascendancy, saw humanity's strength not as a shield, but as a future threat. Fearing they would be next, they unleashed a plague, a tailored genetic weapon called the Soul Blight, that didn't kill humans but severed their connection to their own aggressive instincts, rendering their armies inert, their warriors passive and confused. It was a spiritual genocide. The journal described the final, desperate act of the human race. They did not die. They retreated. Led by a legendary admiral, they gathered the last of their uninfected population, their brightest minds, and their entire armada, and performed the ultimate act of strategic withdrawal. They folded space-time around themselves, creating a self-contained universe, an exile, hidden from the flow of normal time, to wait, to heal, to remember. The Star Wanderer's signal was no distress call. It was a tripwire, a patient trap left behind in the old world. It was designed to remain dormant until a galactic civilization became advanced enough to stumble upon it and try to force its lock. It was a test. If we were smart enough to find the key, we were powerful enough to be a threat. Their return wasn't an invasion. It was a reckoning. As I absorbed the final, heartbreaking entry, an alarm blared through the vault. A shrill, insistent cry. "Kovar," Ilara said, her voice devoid of panic. "He's breached the lower levels." She moved to a nearby console, her fingers flying across the keypad. I can buy you one cycle. There is a smuggler's tunnel behind the chronovault, an old relic from before the archive was sanctified. It leads to the underlevels of the spaceport." She handed me a small, dense data crystal. "I have copied the core truth of the journal, the real history. Memory is a weapon. Kalen. The matriarchs taught us that by trying to bury it. Now, you must learn to wield it. Heavy, Rhythmic footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. The Inquisitors. "Go," she urged. I hesitated, looking from her to the closing door. "What will you do?" A faint, sad smile touched her lips. "I am a keeper of forbidden lore. I think it's time I shared some." I turned and ran. Behind me, I heard the vault door hiss open, followed by Prelate Kovar's cold, clipped voice. I did not hear what Ilara said to him, but I heard the sudden, sharp intake of his breath, a sound of pure, horrified revelation. Then, silence. I didn't look back. I fled through ancient, dust-choked tunnels, the data crystal clutched in my hand, feeling heavier than a dying star. I emerged into the grimy, chaotic underbelly of the Xylos Prime spaceport, a world away from the sterile tranquility of the archive. Ilara's trail led me to a small, battered courier ship, the Vagrant Quill, its transponder codes already scrambled. As I strapped myself into the pilot's seat, a machine I had only ever studied in simulations, the port-wide comms crackled to life. It wasn't a Port Authority warning. It was a Priority 1 Galactic newsfeed, the Shrine of Benevolent Erasure on Cyranus IV, a gleaming monument where the Ascendancy celebrated the peaceful ascension of cultures it had conquered, had been targeted. It had not been destroyed. The single black ship had hung over it, and with a sweep of an unseen beam, the monument's facade had been altered. The list of pacified species was gone. In its place, etched into the very stone in letters of burning light, was a new list. It was a list of names, the names of the Ascendancy commanders, the matriarchs, and the allied species who had unleashed the Soul Blight. Then, the witness's voice, colder and sharper than before, spoke a final sentence that echoed in the cockpit and in the deepest chambers of my heart. "Memory is a weapon. You have taught us this. Now, the lesson begins." I slammed the thrusters forward, the little ship lurching into the sky. I had escaped, but I was not free. I was the keeper of a truth that could burn worlds, a memory that had just been reloaded. I was no longer an archivist, a passive observer of history. I was its last terrified guardian, fleeing into the lawless dark of the Outer Rim, with the ghosts of 2 empires hunting me. The Outer Rim was not a place. It was a condition, a frayed edge of galactic society where laws dissolved into rumor and survival was a currency minted daily. For a fugitive archivist from the coddled core worlds, it was like being thrown into an ocean of static. The Vagrant Quill, Ilara's parting gift, was as anonymous as a ship could be, its hull a patchwork of mismatched alloys, its engines tuned to a common, untraceable frequency. But anonymity was a thin shield. Every port I docked at, from the raucous, neon-drenched asteroid bars of Port Nowhere to the grim, rust-caked industrial docks of Hephaestus, hummed with the news of the Ascendancy's escalating crisis. The witness, the name the galaxy had given the unseen human commander, had moved from quiet erasure to surgical psychological warfare. They were not bombing cities. They were deconstructing a faith. On Praxis, a world renowned for its tranquil meditation temples, the black ships projected holographic images into the clouds, images from the suppressed archives, showing Ascendancy peacekeepers executing Praxian monks who had refused to adopt the doctrine of harmony. On the Githar homeworld, They broadcasted the unredacted military treaty that revealed the Ascendancy had secretly promised their warlords control of neighboring systems in exchange for their allegiance, a promise they never intended to keep. They were using history as a scalpel, cutting away the scar tissue of lies to expose the festering wounds beneath. The Ascendancy's response was a predictable mix of denial and force. They branded the broadcasts as human mimic psyops, the work of a sophisticated Gathar splinter cell. Fleets were mobilized, inquisitors dispatched, and a bounty was placed on the head of the Tenebrese heretic, an anonymous archivist accused of stealing corrupting data and sowing disharmony. My face was not on the wanted posts, but my shadow was. Prelate Kovar was hunting me, and his reach was long. I survived by becoming a ghost. I sold off non-essential ship parts for fuel and ration packs, slept in the cramped cockpit, and learned to filter the truth from the static of barroom gossip and mercenary chatter. I needed a way to get the information on Ilara's data crystal out, to broadcast the truth of the Journal of the Last Fleet. But every major comms relay was an Ascendancy choke point. To transmit from any official channel was to send Kovar my exact coordinates. I needed a black site, an off-grid station powerful enough to pierce the Ascendancy's information blockade. My search led me to whispers of a place called the Crucible, a deep space station hidden within the swirling chaos of the Caliban Nebula. It was a haven for information brokers, code breakers, and data smugglers, the last truly independent comms hub in the known galaxy. It was also, according to the whispers, run by a reclusive and dangerously paranoid information broker who went by the call sign Sci-Fi. Finding the Crucible was a test in itself. There were no charts. Its location was a secret passed through encrypted channels, a puzzle box of hearsay and dead ends. It took me weeks, following breadcrumbs of coded chatter and bribing desperate pilots with the last of my credits, but I finally pieced together the sequence of micro-jumps that would thread the needle through the nebula's volatile plasma storms. The station, when I finally laid eyes on it, was a testament to its owner's paranoia. It was not a gleaming orbital ring, but a jagged agglomeration of salvaged ship hulls, asteroids, and decommissioned military hardware, all fused together like a cancerous growth on the fabric of space. Its sensor profile was a ghost, deliberately mimicking the nebula's background radiation. Docking was a nightmare of automated defense turrets and invasive scans that stripped the Vagrant Quill's systems bare before granting clearance. The interior of the Crucible was a city of perpetual twilight, a maze of narrow corridors and cavernous common areas lit by the flickering glow of data screens and holographic ads. The air was thick with the scent of ozone, recycled air, and a dozen alien spices. It was a place where no one made eye contact, and everyone listened. After a tense negotiation with a sub-broker who seemed to have more chrome than flesh, I secured a meeting with Sci-Fi. The meeting took place not in an office, but in a virtual data space, a minimalist construct of white light and floating geometric shapes. Sci-Fi's avatar was a featureless, chrome mannequin, its voice a synthesized androgynous monotone. There was no personality, only function. I explained my request. I needed to broadcast a single, heavily encrypted data packet to every open receiver in the galaxy, bypassing all Ascendancy firewalls. Sci-Fi's avatar tilted its head. The data is dangerous. It was not a question. It's the truth, I countered. The Ascendancy fears it. The Ascendancy's fear is a commodity. Sci-Fi replied. My neutrality is my shield. A broadcast of this magnitude is not a business transaction. It is an act of war. It would bring the full weight of the matriarchs down upon this station. The price would be astronomical. I have nothing left to offer, I admitted, my hope sinking. You have the data itself, the avatar stated. You wish to give it away for free, an act of pure, unprofitable ideology. I, on the other hand, understand its true value. Give me an exclusive copy. Allow me to decrypt and sell its contents to my private clients, mercenary guilds, corporate entities, rival political factions for one cycle before you broadcast it to the masses. Give me the greatest information scoop in a millennium, and your broadcast will be my gift to the galaxy. The proposal was grotesque. To sell the tragic history of a betrayed species to the highest bidder felt like a desecration of Ilara's sacrifice. But I was out of options. The truth was a weapon, she had said. And weapons, in the Outer Rim, were always for sale. I agreed. The cycle I waited for Sci-Fi to work was the longest of my life. I huddled in the vagrant quill, watching the station's denizens scurry through their shadowy lives, wondering if I had just made a deal with the devil or a necessary compromise with reality. Then it began. The first sign was a flicker. Throughout the crucible, data screens and holo ads glitched, their usual stream of commerce and vice momentarily replaced by a single, stark image, a page from the Journal of the Last Fleet, showing the crest of the human armada. Then Sci-Fi's work was done, and my broadcast began. It was not a quiet, insidious transmission. It was a roar. Using every ounce of the Crucible's power, the data crystal's contents were flung across the galaxy. It was the raw, unredacted text of the journal, translated into 1,000 languages, accompanied by verifiable pre-ascendancy star charts, military logs, and damning internal communiques that Sci-Fi's decryption algorithms had unearthed from the packet's deepest layers. The truth of the Soul Blight, the betrayal, and the human retreat into exile hit the galactic consciousness like a physical blow. On worlds that had long histories of being harmonized, the broadcast sparked riots. In the fleets, where crews were a mix of species, old suspicions and resentments flared into open mutinies. The Ascendancy's carefully constructed narrative of a benevolent, unified galaxy shattered in a matter of hours. But something else happened, something I hadn't anticipated. The witness responded. As the truth of their past echoed across the stars, the black ships changed their tactics. They stopped their psychological attacks. Instead, they began a systematic, silent campaign of interdiction. They appeared at key Ascendancy military shipyards, not to attack, but to form impenetrable blockades. They disabled hyperlane relays, cutting off fleet movements. They surrounded the Matriarch's home system of sanctum, severing it from the rest of their crumbling empire. They were not conquering, they were containing. They were placing the Ascendancy in a cage of its own making, leaving the burgeoning rebellions and civil wars to fester without reinforcement. It was a strategy of brilliant, cold patience. They had provided the spark. Now they were content to stand back and watch the fire consume the forest. My victory felt hollow. I had wanted to expose a lie, to honor a memory. Instead, I had plunged the galaxy into chaos. I had traded the cold, sterile peace of the Ascendancy for the hot, bloody birth of 1,000 new conflicts. As I watched the news feeds from the Crucible's main concourse, showing worlds burning and fleets turning on each other, A new broadcast cut through the noise. It was Prelate Kovar. His face was projected on every screen, no longer calm and severe, but filled with a righteous fury. He stood before the grand altar of harmony on Sanctum, the matriarch's veiled forms arrayed behind him. The heretic has shown his hand. Kovar's voice boomed. He has allied himself with the human demons, using their lies to poison our unity. But we will not falter. Harmony will be restored. Then his image was replaced by a star chart. A single system was highlighted Xylos Prime. To prove our resolve, we will make an example of the world that birthed this heresy. We will purify the great archive, the source of this corruption, and all who dwell there. We will remind the galaxy that the price of disharmony is oblivion. My blood turned to ice. He was going to burn my home. He was going to murder my people to punish me. At that moment, a private comm request chimed in the cockpit of the Vagrant Quill. The encryption was unlike any I had ever seen. Complex and layered, shifting like smoke. I accepted the call. The screen remained dark, but a voice filled the small space. The same calm, female voice that had spoken from the void over Tenebris. The witness. Archivist Kalen, she said. My name spoken for the first time. You have returned our memory to the galaxy. For that, you have our gratitude. You have also, unintentionally, signed your world's death warrant. The ascendancy is predictable in its cruelty. There was a pause, a moment that felt as long as a lifetime. We do not intervene in the conflicts of others. That was our old flaw. But you are not other. You are the keeper of our truth. The great archive is now a part of our history, and we do not allow our history to be burned. The line went dead. I stared at the blank screen, my heart pounding a frantic, terrifying rhythm. I had started a war of memory, and now the ghosts of history were coming to fight it. The journey to Xylos Prime was a flight through the heart of a shattered empire. The hyperlanes, once the orderly arteries of ascendancy commerce, were now clogged with refugees and rebels, pirates and warlords. Systems that had been unified for centuries had fractured along ancient, tribal lines. The Gathar were carving out a new kingdom in the Galactic East. The Praxian monks had declared their temples sovereign territory, and a dozen corporate states had seceded, their private fleets protecting their assets from the spreading chaos. It was the future Ilara had warned of, the forest fire ignited by the single seed of truth I had planted. And at the center of it all, the human fleet, the force of nature I had unleashed, remained a phantom. They enforced their blockades with terrifying efficiency but took no sides in the burgeoning conflicts. They were the storm wall, containing the hurricane of the Ascendancy's collapse while letting the winds inside tear everything apart. I pushed the Vagrant Quill to its limits, the small ship groaning under the strain of continuous jumps. My mind was a maelstrom of guilt and fear. Kovar's threat was not a bluff. The purification of a world was a standard, if rarely used, tool in the Ascendancy's arsenal. It was a brutal public spectacle designed to terrify other systems into compliance. It meant orbital bombardment, not with the surgical precision of the humans, but with the indiscriminate, world-scorching fury of a dying god. I was flying not just to save my home, but to witness the consequences of my actions, written in fire across the face of my planet. I arrived in the Xylos system on the eve of its judgment. The Ascendancy's purification fleet was already in position, a grim constellation of gray, blocky warships forming a perimeter around my homeworld. They were older ships, the dregs of the Imperial Navy, but there were hundreds of them, a blunt instrument of overwhelming force. Leading them was the Iron Creed, Kovar's flagship, a vessel designed less for combat and more for intimidation, its hull bristling with the massive thermal lances used for planetary scouring. Against them, Xylos Prime had nothing. Our defenses were symbolic, our fleet ceremonial. We were a world of librarians, not warriors. I kept the vagrant quill hidden in the system's outer asteroid belt, my sensors pushed to their maximum, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. The Ascendancy broadcast its ultimatum on all channels, a final piece of theater before the slaughter. Prelate Kovar's face, now a mask of zealous certainty, filled my screen. He demanded the unconditional surrender of the Xylosian government and the public execution of all senior archivists. He gave them 1 standard hour to comply. It was an impossible demand, designed to be refused. He didn't want surrender, he wanted an excuse. I watched the clock on my console count down, each second a hammer blow against the anvil of my soul. I was helpless, a spectator at the funeral of my own world. With 10 minutes left on the clock, something changed. The fabric of space near the system's edge shimmered, buckled, and then tore open. It was not the chaotic rupture of a standard hyperlane entry. This was a silent, controlled incision. From the tier emerged a single vessel. It was the Crescent Blade ship from the Forbidden Archives, the flagship I had seen only in grainy drone footage and panicked reports. The Warden. It was immense, larger than any ship in the Ascendancy fleet. Its hull the color of a starless midnight, scarred with the memory of ancient battles. It moved with a silent, impossible grace, a predator gliding into a field of panicked herbivores. It made no sound, broadcasted no challenge. It simply existed, its presence a defiant violation of Ascendancy authority. For a moment, the entire system held its breath. The Purification Fleet, for all its bluster, seemed frozen, stunned by the sheer audacity of the arrival. Kovar, his face still on the main broadcast, was momentarily speechless, his zealous mask cracking to reveal a flicker of pure shock. Then, his training took over. A single human vessel, he spat, his voice regaining its manufactured confidence. A ghost from a dead empire, they have come to witness the fate of their heretic allies. All ships ignore it. Prepare the primary lances. The purification will proceed on schedule. The witness's voice, the calm, female voice that now haunted my dreams, cut through his broadcast. It was not broadcast from the Warden, but from everywhere at once, seeming to emanate from the very vacuum of space. "Prelate Kovar," she said, her tone carrying a chilling hint of academic curiosity. "Your historical records are, as usual, inaccurate. We are not a single vessel." As she spoke, the space around the Warden began to ripple, one by one, like shards of night coalescing from the void. More ships appeared, dozens of them, sleek, black destroyers shaped like daggers, silent frigates that moved like hunting cats, and smaller, impossibly fast interceptors that darted between them like wasps. The human remnant fleet. They hadn't used a hyperlane. They had been there all along, hidden in some fold of space-time, waiting. The Purification Fleet, which moments before had seemed like an overwhelming force, now looked like a collection of clumsy, outdated toys. The technological disparity was terrifyingly obvious. Kovar, seeing his advantage evaporate, made a fatal error born of desperation. "Fire!" he screamed. "Fire the lances! Burn the planet! Leave them nothing to save!" The thermal lances on the Iron Creed and its escort cruisers began to glow, their immense energy building for the killing blow. Before they could discharge, the human fleet moved. It wasn't a battle. It was a dissection. The black ships did not fire traditional weapons. They unleashed those same lances of pure void, beams of targeted nothingness that erased whatever they touched. One cruiser, its lance at peak charge, simply vanished in the middle of its firing sequence. Another was neatly severed in two, its halves drifting apart in perfect, silent symmetry. The human interceptors moved in a blur, disabling the smaller frigates not by destroying them, but by using some kind of localized energy pulse that instantly fried their power cores, leaving them dark and adrift. The entire engagement lasted less than 2 minutes. Over 200 Ascendancy ships were neutralized without a single explosive detonation, without a single chaotic debris field. It was the cleanest, most efficient act of naval warfare I had ever witnessed. It was pest control. Only the Iron Creed remained, its thermal lances cold and inert, its hull bracketed by 2 human destroyers. Then, a new kind of vessel detached from the Warden. It was small, angular, and it moved with a purpose that was chillingly direct. It was a boarding craft. "Prillit Kovar," the witness's voice returned. "You have an overdue book. We are here to collect." On a private, encrypted channel, a message lit up my console on the vagrant quill. "Stay hidden. Stay silent. Your part is not yet over." The boarding party was small, no more than a dozen figures. They breached the Iron Creed's bridge with a silent, explosive charge that turned the armored door to dust. I watched through a magnified sensor feed as soldiers in matte black armor moved with a fluid, predatory grace that was utterly inhuman. They were not the lumbering brutes of ascendancy propaganda. They were ghosts, their movements economical and final. Kovar, his faith shattered, his fleet gone, stood before them, a pathetic figure of defiance. He raised his ceremonial energy staff, a symbol of his office. The lead soldier, a figure slightly taller than the rest, did not even raise their weapon. They simply stepped forward, their hand moving in a blur, and disarmed him, the staff clattering uselessly to the deck. The soldiers did not kill the bridge crew. They moved past them, their objective clear. They secured Kovar, binding him with some kind of energy field, and then turned to the ship's main console. One of the soldiers, a specialist, interfaced with it, their gloved fingers dancing across the controls. A few moments later, Kovar's terrified face was once again broadcast across the system, but this time he was not in control. The feed was from his own bridge, showing him restrained, defeated. "People of the Ascendancy," the witness's voice spoke over the image. "This is Prillit Kovar of the Inquisition of Harmony. He came to this system to burn a world in the name of your matriarchs, to erase a truth he deemed disharmonious. He has failed." The view shifted, showing the neutralized, drifting wrecks of the purification fleet. "Your fleets are obsolete. Your faith is a lie. Your empire is a cage of your own making. We have not come to conquer you. We have come to set you free." The image on the screen changed again. It was the page from the Journal of the Last Fleet describing the Soul Blight. The names of the betrayers glowing like fresh blood. "This is your history. This is your sin. Live with it, or die by it. The choice is yours. The broadcast ended. The human fleet did not linger. The boarding craft returned to the warden, taking Kovar with them. Then, as silently as they had arrived, the entire fleet folded space and vanished, leaving behind a ghost fleet of disabled Ascendancy warships and a single, stunned planet. I sat in the cockpit of the Vagrant Quill, trembling, the silence of space pressing in on me. I had expected a battle for my home. I had not expected a lesson. The humans hadn't just saved Xylos Prime, they had used the moment to deliver their true ultimatum to the galaxy. They weren't fighting a war for territory or resources, they were fighting a war for reality itself. And their weapon was the one thing the Ascendancy could never defeat: the truth. The message on my console blinked again. Xylos Prime is secure. The Great Archive is safe. Now. Archivist, it is time for you to come home. It was not a request. It was a summons. The ghosts I had woken were no longer content to speak from the void. They wanted to meet the librarian who had checked out their book. The summons led me not to the surface of my homeworld, but to the warden itself. The Vagrant Quill was guided into the Crescent Blade's hangar bay by a silent tractor beam. The moment I docked, the contrast between my battered little ship and the vessel that held it was profound. The hangar was a cathedral of dark metal and soft, crimson light, vast and impeccably clean. The air tasted pure, recycled to a perfect standard, without the scent of oil or ozone that permeated every other ship I had ever been on. There were no chattering mechanics or bellowing officers. Only quiet figures in black armor moving with a focused, unnerving precision. They were all human, taller on average than the figures in the historical records, their builds lean and athletic under the form-fitting armor. They moved with a coiled stillness, an economy of motion that spoke of absolute confidence. They were not soldiers in the way I understood the term. They were predators at rest. I was met at my airlock by two of them. They wore no insignia, their helmets sealed, hiding their faces. They did not speak, merely gestured for me to follow. The corridors of the warden were like its exterior, silent, dark, and functional. There was no art, no decoration, only the faint hum of a power source so immense it seemed to vibrate in my very bones. This was not a home. It was a weapon, honed to a singular purpose. They led me to an observation deck at the apex of the ship's blade. The outer wall was a single, transparent sheet of what I assumed was diamond-hard crystal, offering a breathtaking, panoramic view of my homeworld floating serenely below. A lone figure stood with her back to me, gazing at the planet. She was not wearing armor, but a simple, dark gray uniform that was elegant in its austerity. Her short hair was the color of spun silver, and her posture was one of relaxed authority. When she turned, her face was etched with the fine lines of age and experience, but her eyes were startlingly clear and sharp, holding the patient, unwavering focus of a star itself. I knew now with absolute certainty that I was looking at the witness. Archivist Kalen, she said. Her voice was the same one I had heard from the void, but in person, it held a warmth, a resonance that the comms had flattened. Welcome aboard the Warden. I am Admiral Eva Rostova. She was human, undeniably so, yet she felt like something more, or perhaps something other, a living embodiment of a history I had only ever read. You have questions, she stated, gesturing to the chair opposite her. Please. I sat, my mind racing, 1,000 questions vying for precedence. Why was all I could manage to ask. Why all of this? The silence, the surgical strikes, the lessons. Rostova smiled faintly, a sad, knowing expression. Because we learned from our first mistake, Kalen. In the old war, we fought for victory. We met armies with armies, fleets with fleets. We believed that if we simply defeated our enemies, peace would follow. She turned back to the view of Xylos Prime. We won every battle, but we lost the war. We learned that you cannot kill an idea with a weapon. The Ascendancy is not an empire of ships and soldiers. It is an empire of belief, built on a foundation of lies. To fight it with fire and steel would only create martyrs and new lies. It would make us the monsters they always claimed we were. So you fight with memory, I whispered, understanding dawning. Precisely, she confirmed. You gave us the key. You broadcast the truth of our past. Our only goal since then has been to ensure that truth cannot be erased again. We don't want to rule the galaxy. We want it to be free of the illusion that has kept it stagnant for a millennium. We are not conquerors. We are librarians. Of a sort, we are merely correcting the record on a galactic scale. The sheer audacity, the incredible, patient arrogance of it left me breathless. They had spent centuries in exile, not just healing or rebuilding their fleets, but planning a new kind of war. What about Kovar? I asked. And the others you've captured. They are being educated. Rostova replied simply. We are showing them the unredacted history, not just of our betrayal, but of their own cultures. The parts the Ascendancy forced them to forget. Some will learn. Others will not. But they will not be harmed. We do not create martyrs. And what happens now? I asked. The Ascendancy is broken. The galaxy is in chaos. Good, she said, her voice firm. Chaos is the precursor to change. Systems will fall. New powers will rise. There will be war. There will be suffering. But it will be real. It will be born of genuine conflict and ambition, not orchestrated by a lie. The galaxy is finally waking from a long, drugged sleep. It will be a painful process, but it is a necessary one. She finally turned her full attention to me, her gaze intense. Which is why we brought you here. The age of the Ascendancy is over. The age of memory is beginning. The great archive on your world is no longer just a Xylosian treasure. It is the most important library in the galaxy. It must be protected, but it must also be re-educated. The lies must be purged, the truth restored. She offered me a choice, not to join them, not to become human, but to become something more. She offered me the position of chief curator of the restored Great Archive, to work with her people historians, linguists, and data specialists to rebuild the galactic historical record. It would be a monumental task, a project of centuries, to sift through the Ascendancy's propaganda and rediscover the truths they had buried. It was a chance not just to be a keeper of memory, but a builder of it. Your species chose to be observers, Rostova said, her voice softening. It was a noble choice, born of pain, but to observe is not enough when the truth itself is under attack. To be a true archivist is not a passive act. It requires participation. It requires a willingness to fight for the integrity of the story. As she spoke, an alert chimed softly on a nearby console. Rostova glanced at it, her expression unchanged. The matriarchs have responded to Kovar's capture. They have declared us a corrupting cosmic influence and have called for a grand crusade to exterminate us. The last of their loyal fleets are gathering at Sanctum." I felt a chill. "Will you fight them? We will not have to," she said. She gestured to the console, which now showed a tactical map of the Sanctum system. Dozens of new fleet icons were appearing at its edges, but they were not human ships. They were Gathar destroyers, Praxian cruisers, and corporate dreadnoughts, the fleets of the newly freed peoples, the ones who had seen the truth and chosen to fight for their own future. They had come to tear down the last vestiges of the old lie themselves. "You see," Rostova said, "we didn't start a war. We ended a deception. The rest is up to them." I looked from the map back to my world, floating like a perfect jewel in the darkness. My people were safe. The archive was safe. Elara's sacrifice had been vindicated. The choice she offered me was the one I had been unknowingly searching for my entire life, a way to turn my quiet rebellion into a meaningful reconstruction, to trade my cowardice for a purpose. "I accept," I said, my voice steady for the first time in months. The Age of Fire had ended, not with an explosion, but with the turning of a page. A new age was dawning, an age of memory, and it would be messy, chaotic, and true. And I, Kalen, the last archivist of the old world, would be there to help write the first chapter. The work would be long, and the peace uncertain. But for the first time since I opened that forbidden file, I was not afraid. I was home.